He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I started to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday and Friday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content such as interviews and D&D campaigns at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the wood not a creature was stirring where the shadow stood. The trail cams were hung by the hunters with care, in hopes that the Sasquatch soon would be there. The hunters were nestled, all snug in their tent, while nearby a cryptid picked up their scent. With the guns put away, after reading their maps, they all settled down for a long winter's nap. When out in the forest there rose such chatter, the hunters awoke to see what was the matter. They grabbed their guns and jumped out like a flash to exit the tent and see what had dashed. The moonlight shone down on the campsite below, giving a luminous aesthetic, making the landscape glow. When what to the wondering eyes of the hunters should appear but a 7-foot-tall cryptid, just as they feared. With a hairy body, so large and quick, they knew in a moment that it was a Sasquatch. Faster than an eagle, the cryptid stepped back, whistling and howling as it moved to the black. Is what this cryptid said. Hiding in the shadows, the hunters now fled. Back to their vehicles, which were a mile away. The Bigfoot escorted them so they would not go astray. When they found the trucks, they proceeded to leave, when the rocks started hitting with a powerful heave. As they all drove away down the dirt back road, they could see up ahead a floating light that glowed. And then in an instant, they heard on the roof the impact of more rocks going poof, poof, poof. As they readied their guns and turned on their lights, they saw another cryptid. It caused such a fright. It was covered in fur from its head to its feet. It had sharp teeth and a snout. It smiled as it greet. With dog-like ears, it dropped to all fours. It looked just like a canine, and then it roared. Its eyes, how they glowed, dark red like a cherry. It started to crawl over. Oh my, how it was scary. The saliva from its mouth had begun to drool. They knew it was toying. It was truly cruel. Away from the creature, they continued to drive. Some time had now passed. They knew they'd survive. As they kept on driving, it descended from up high. With big red eyes, it was flying in the sky. The hunters saw a sign as they drove on past. It read Point Pleasant. Gosh, the road's vast. With the head of a moth and wings like a bat, the cryptid swooped in, ready to attack. It screeched something fierce as it flew past the truck. The hunters all panicked, thinking we're shit out of luck. When all of a sudden, it jumped out from the bush. The hairy Sasquatch returned with one fell swoosh. It frightened the Mothman, sending it off in a hurry. The Bigfoot victorious, while the hunters all scurried. The Sasquatch stood up, whistling with glee. The hunters now gone, his forest was free. As it crept back to shadow, it chattered with might. Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night. Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Cryptid Clues, Campfire Clues. Different from our usual format as Christmas is just around the corner and I want to add some pizzazz to that classic 'Twas the Night Before Christmas poem. But of course, Cryptid Clues isn't Cryptid Clues without at least a couple encounter stories. But before we get into that, a couple of plugs. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, and our Patreon where we get ad-free early episodes. And should you want to reach out to us directly, you can via our email, cryptidclues@gmail.com. So without further ado, let's get into our first encounter. Now this takes place in British Columbia, Canada, back in 1960 near Pitt Lake. It was around mid-August. There was a young kid and his friend Barry were set to go on a 2 to 3 day camping trip to Pitt Lake. Note that Pitt Lake is about west of both Stave Lake and Harrison by quite a distance, but still to the west. It's below Garibaldi Provincial Park and even closer to the Golden Ears Provincial Park, both which are just north of Pitt Lake. So Barry's father had set up a boat ride for the two. They were to set off for an isolated beach at the mouth of Debec Creek. Now, there were a few other folks joining them, and there's another child and another adult, I believe, but for them to go out here, they were young, so obviously they had to go with a group. They couldn't go alone to this remote location, so the group was picked up at the Pitt Lake boat launch, and they headed north up Pitt Lake for about 15 kilometers. The group was dropped off along with their gear on the beach of Debec Creek, along with the promise from the boat driver that he would check back in each morning doing his work runs just to make sure they were all still okay. Well, the weather at that time was very nice, warm, clear skies, so they opted not to use a tent, just sleeping bags and blankets. When the group found a nice flat spot on the gravel beach to make camp, the two young kids, they opted for a nearby hole to tuck into. Now, the hole itself was inside a cedar tree root system, so it was more like a little cave, just big enough for the kids to sneak into. Now, the usual camping activities ensued: campfires, roasting wieners, swimming in the lake, quick little hikes, fishing by the creek, just an overall good time. However, in retrospect, there was one prominent thing that occurred which is speculated to have played a part in what was about to unfold. Now, the first night when the kids were to sleep, they had a wolf howling contest until finally they were told to be quiet and stop. Now, after they had fallen asleep from their little howling session, the specific sound that woke them back up, it was not identified. It happened during daybreak, and it was scary enough that both kids woke up immediately at the same time and raced towards Barry's parent nearby. So when they got to Barry's dad, he was already awake too. He heard what was going on, and he was holding his .303 British Army rifle in his hands. The look on his face was that of being rattled, shaking, as pale as a ghost. Being kids at the time, they both knew by looking at the dad's reaction and facial expressions that something was not at all right. Now, this didn't help alleviate the concerns of the kids at the time, who did ask Barry's dad what was wrong. He responded by saying he had his rifle loaded and aimed at a big black bear that was walking around continuously on its hind legs. It was sniffing around, pawing as well, doing laps around the log that both Barry and his friend were sleeping in the roots. The kids could deduce that bears don't normally walk on their hind legs, so this prompted them to figure Barry's dad's story as just being bogus. So, the next day after breakfast, Barry went off to explore the tree log and perhaps catch a track or two. While some larger footprints were found, nothing was concrete enough to make a plaster with, unfortunately. So whatever it was, I see two plausible outcomes. A bear? Okay, and perhaps it wants to get into the root area as a den, or a Sasquatch, perhaps attracted by all the wolf howls it heard the kids doing earlier that night. Either way, I do reckon that because the kids had crawled into such a tight area, it prevented this larger animal from properly getting to them until Barry's dad woke up and shouldered his rifle. Now, there are some additional points of interest since this occurrence. Happening years later, when the kids got older, in 2003, there's a man from Abbotsford, British Columbia, that had reached out to them and reported seeing a Sasquatch less than 1 mile away from where they had camped in the tree root. Another report has 2 prospectors working just under 5 miles away, also encountering a Sasquatch, which they guessed was about 12 to 15 feet tall, that was leaving 22 to 24-inch footprints. Now, if we look towards 1933, we have another report of 2 men that witnessed a Sasquatch eating berries about 3 miles from Debec Creek. So this area in general seems like a hot spot, but not hot enough to deter the construction of a lodge up there. Called the Pit River Lodge. This lodge is still very much active and looks like it's great accommodations. I have no affiliation with them or anything. I just looked at images, so I'm speaking for myself. However, the 3 individuals, as well as the lodge owner, they managed to find fresh 17-inch Bigfoot tracks in a particular valley out in that area. And after spending much time flying over the landscape, at least to the lodge owner, it became apparent that only one valley was open to traverse along, between Pitt Lake, Stave Lake, and Harrison Lake. It's funny how these areas are all subject to a plethora of sightings. Now, again, I have visited Harrison, a great little community and a massively unending forest surrounding it. But to cap off this encounter, one prominent notion that occurs regarding this valley is the suspicion that perhaps Bigfoot does migrate along specific routes. I know I've looked into other encounters where the Sasquatch, it seems like, okay, they go from point A to point B, and that point B is far away. These are long journeys that they're going and making all within a span of a day. But I digress. Again, this isn't fact. It's based on the assumption that only one valley is accessible from Pitt Lake onwards. It's impossible to dismiss, however, whether or not Bigfoot may have other means of traveling. It could be interdimensional trajectories, or it could be an underground cave system that's even easily accessible. So it definitely is. It's not backed by any facts, but there are different options on the table as to how they are going along. And while this valley one is definitely a very, very popular one, I would say, and something even I could get behind, because when you look at the general lay of the land, you have 2 national parks and you have this valley flowing through some very treacherous parts too, where you're hiking through, but you have this valley going along. And sure enough, Harrison Lake, this is one of the biggest hotspots of Bigfoot in British Columbia. And it connects right up to Pitt Lake here. I mean, when you go through Stave Lake has a whole assortment of encounters going on there too. So, yeah, coincidence? I don't know. But without further ado, let's jump to a quick ad break before we dive into one more encounter. So we'll be right back. And we're back. So to cap off this episode, we're going to take a look at the Rocky Mountains of Canada. Now, without a specific date, we can only estimate this was around the beginning of May back in 1997. This individual was traveling via the Trans-Canada Highway, heading to Banff from Vancouver. Now, they suspect it was around 11 a.m.-ish. The weather was getting a little damp, with clouds looming overhead. This is classic West Coast weather, but they did note visibility was still great. Having been already informed about Bigfoot, even reading into Thomas Steenberg's books, this is one of the motivations to do this sort of lengthy drive for this individual. Even so, checking out hotspots or specific spots along the way. So once they reached the Fraser River area near Seabird Island, they were detouring to check out a possible Sasquatch sighting area, along with their partner, who was using a video camera at the time to film them singing whilst driving. And then there it was. The embarrassing moment resulted in the driver turning their head to face out the window away from the camera when they saw it. Note, they were traveling at around 60 miles per hour, and this happened very quickly. A large thing jumped out of the woods and began to kneel down in a motion that seemed similar to someone going to wash their hands. Now, the camera didn't capture anything visually, but it did record the audible reaction. Being convinced they spotted a Sasquatch, they claimed it was a very tall creature, had no neck, and the immediate sighting of it caused an instant degree of fear. This individual got prompted a lot, however, as why they just didn't turn around and try to find it again. I resonate a lot with their statement that indeed most Canadian highways, it's so freaking difficult to find a U-turn or a turn off. Most of the times you have to go like quite a length of distance before you can make that turn and go back the way you came. It's horrible when you're leaving some towns. It truly, truly is. Let alone finding a parking spot nearby along the road. That's even another nightmare to try and do. So I don't blame them for not choosing to turn around. It would have taken a long time to do so. The conclusion that they had was that during this long time to turn around, what's the point? Because this thing's going to be long gone. Now, the tape was analyzed, but nothing prominent was able to be deduced from it. There was no creature captured in it. It was just the surprise reaction, and that is it, unfortunately. As is the case with many recordings, sadly, but there's been some interesting videos lately. I'm not going to get into those this episode, but there's been some very interesting drone shots that have been occurring lately. So I've been talking with Ruben, just trying to see what do you think about this? Do you think this is worth talking about? And we just kind of formulate our own opinions and perspectives on it. But I digress. That is for another episode. This, however, concludes our last episode before Christmas. I hope you all have a truly safe and wonderful holiday with friends, family, and food. We'll be back on Monday. Ruben and I did some pre-recording homework this month so we could take an extended period of time off to be with our families this holiday season. But there's, of course, no way we could just up and go without leaving you all with some good content to listen to up until the new year. So remember, you can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, and also on our Patreon, where you can get ad-free early episodes. And if you ever want to reach out to us directly, you can via our email at CryptidClues@gmail.com. So until then, everyone, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, take care, and stay safe.